The wind tore across the fjord like a living blade, whipping icy spray into the faces of the men on deck. Frost crept along the timber, covering oars, ropes, and shields in a thin, glittering layer that made every surface treacherous. Below them, the black water roared and churned, shards of ice breaking off from the frozen edges and scraping against the hulls. Each wave threatened to tip the longship, and each misstep could mean plunging into near-frozen death. The Vikings moved with practiced rhythm, oars dipping in perfect unison, their muscles burning despite the numbness spreading through their limbs. No one spoke above the roar of the storm. There was no time for chatter, only the constant, tense awareness that survival depended on precision and instinct. Every man's breath came in misty clouds, curling and vanishing into the storm. Below deck, the cabin was a fragile refuge from the merciless cold. Smoke from the small fire swirled upward, carrying the scent of burning pine and dried fish. Men huddled close, sharing warmth, swapping stories of past raids and comparing scars. The firelight danced over fur-lined clothing and etched faces, casting long shadows that flickered across the wooden walls. Even here, safety was temporary. The cold was relentless, seeping through every crack in the planks, gnawing at skin and bone. Yet the Vikings thrived in this environment because they had learned to respect it, to anticipate it. They understood the deadly patterns of wind and tide, the behavior of ice and snow, the subtle cues that foretold disaster. Their ships were more than vessels, they were lifelines, crafted for speed, balance, and endurance. The longship could cut through frozen waves like a blade, and when the men rowed as one, they became a single organism, unstoppable even in the harshest storms. As the storm raged on, every sense was heightened. Every splash, creak, and distant howl of the wind demanded attention. Mistimed oars, a misjudged turn, or hesitation could send a man overboard. Yet, amidst the danger, there was exhilaration, a raw clarity born from facing death and cold together. They were Vikings, hardened by frost, tested by sea, and united in a single unspoken purpose: to endure, to conquer, and to survive the coldest nights of the world. Night fell like a heavy shroud over the snow-laden village. The wind screamed through narrow alleys between timbered homes, rattling shutters and sending drifts of powdery snow swirling into corners. Inside the longhouses, the heart of Viking life, warmth and light battled the creeping cold. The central hearth roared, flames licking the wooden beams, smoke curling toward the low blackened ceilings. Men, women, and children huddled around it, their faces glowing in the firelight, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The longhouse was more than shelter, it was survival. Thick walls of timber, insulated with sod and straw, held back the merciless bite of winter. Every inch of space was calculated for warmth. Sleeping benches lined the sides, piled high with furs, blankets, and woven mats. Livestock were brought inside during the harshest nights, not just for food, but as living heaters, their bodies radiating heat into the icy air. The Vikings understood the cold as both foe and teacher. They knew that, without preparation, a single night could mean death by frostbite or hypothermia. Food was fuel, and the longhouse was alive with the scent of dried fish, salted meats, and hearty stews simmering over the hearth. Each meal was calculated to sustain men through endless toil in the snow, to keep limbs warm and bodies moving. Women chopped firewood with swift precision, ensuring the hearth never faltered, while men repaired boots, patched cloaks, and mended furs for the next day. Every action, no matter how small, was an act of survival. Stories and songs rose above the crackling fire, weaving warmth into the atmosphere. The old tales of gods and heroes were more than entertainment. They were lessons in endurance, courage, and cunning. Young ones listened with wide eyes, learning how their ancestors had faced storms, famine, and battle. In every tale, the cold was present, a constant challenge to strength and ingenuity. Even in the shelter of the longhouse, the Vikings respected the night. The wind moaned through cracks, a reminder that outside, the frozen world awaited. The smoke-stained rafters bore witness to countless winters endured, each one a test of body and spirit. They had learned to layer furs, to wrap themselves in blankets, to huddle together for warmth. They had learned that survival was never passive. It required attention, preparation, and respect for the forces that could claim life in an instant. As the fire dimmed toward midnight, shadows danced across frost-coated walls. Children slept wrapped in furs, their small bodies rising and falling with dreams of distant seas and snowy battles. Adults kept vigil in turns, listening for the howl of wolves or the groan of timber under ice-laden wind. Every night was a lesson, every winter a crucible. And as the longhouse held fast against the cold, the Vikings understood the truth that had kept their people alive for generations. Unity, courage, and fire, both in the hearth and in the heart, were their greatest weapons against the frozen world beyond the doors. The world outside the longhouse was a silent, white expanse. Snow blanketed the forests, frozen rivers glimmered under the pale winter sun, and the wind cut through the trees like sharpened steel. Survival meant venturing into this unforgiving wilderness, armed with skill, knowledge, and nerves of iron. The Vikings did not simply hunt, they read the land, learned its secrets, and respected its dangers. The forest was alive in winter, though it whispered in hushed tones. Tracks in the snow revealed the passage of deer, hares, and smaller creatures. Wolves prowled the shadows, their eyes glinting with hunger. Men and women moved cautiously, boots crunching against frost-hardened earth, cloaks pulled tight against the biting wind. Each step was measured, each movement deliberate. A careless sound could mean the loss of a meal or a life. Gathering firewood was survival itself. Branches weighed down with snow had to be broken and carried back to the longhouse, where every splintered log fueled the hearth that kept families alive. The strongest trees were reserved for construction and repair, but no wood could be wasted. Even fallen branches were prized for their heat. Children, bundled in furs, learned early how to scavenge for kindling, their small hands becoming nimble in the cold. Hunting required skill beyond brute strength. Bowstrings were tested and arrows sharpened before dawn. Snares were carefully set along animal paths, hidden beneath snowdrifts. The Vikings knew the rhythms of the forest, the deer that grazed at twilight, the rabbits that darted under cover of snow-laden brush. Success was not guaranteed, and failure could mean hunger gnawing at the belly for days. Yet they hunted not with recklessness, but with patient cunning, understanding that every kill was sacred, a gift of survival to be respected and used fully. Foraging was equally vital. Beneath frozen soil and snow, roots and tubers waited to be uncovered. Berries, frozen but edible, were collected and preserved for long months ahead. Herbs were gathered for flavor, for medicine, for warding off illness during endless nights of frost and isolation. Every plant had a purpose, every bite a carefully calculated addition to the diet that would sustain bodies through the harshest season. Back at the longhouse, the fruits of these dangerous expeditions were transformed into sustenance. Deer was roasted over the fire, fish simmered in salted broth, roots and herbs became nourishing stews. Salt, smoke, and drying preserved them against the cold months to come. Every meal was more than food, it was life, a small victory won against the relentless winter. As night fell, the hunters returned, snow clinging to their furs, breath steaming in the firelight. The longhouse welcomed them with warmth, laughter, and relief. Outside, the world was frozen, silent, and cruel. Inside, life endured. The Vikings understood that survival was not granted, it was earned, daily, through knowledge, courage, and respect for the frozen lands that challenged them at every turn. The cold was not an enemy to be fought with sword and shield. It was a silent, persistent adversary that gnawed at exposed skin and seeped into bone. To survive the longest nights, the Vikings wrapped themselves in layers of protection, crafting an armor as essential as any battle gear. Fur, wool, and leather became lifelines, each stitch a shield against frostbite, each layer a barrier against the merciless wind. The outer cloak was heavy, often made from sheepskin or reindeer hide, thick and coarse, but pliable enough to allow movement. It draped over shoulders, flowing down to the calves, protecting the body from blizzards that could strip warmth in minutes. Beneath it, tunics of wool insulated the torso, while leggings and stockings, sometimes reinforced with fur, encased the legs in warmth. Every inch of exposed skin was a risk. Even the hands were wrapped in gloves, sometimes layered leather over wool, fingers dexterous yet protected, essential for wielding tools or tending a fire. Footwear was crafted with equal care. Boots were sewn from tanned hides, soles often layered with straw or moss for insulation. Ice and snow could not penetrate this barrier easily, and the moss absorbed sweat to prevent frostbite from within. Traveling long distances across frozen tundra or hunting in icy forests demanded that every step conserve heat, and every boot was a silent testament to the ingenuity born of necessity. Hoods and caps were vital. Some were simple fur-lined hoods that framed the face. Others were crafted with intricate weaving to trap air and warmth, the edges sometimes reinforced with leather to resist piercing wind. Masks or scarves of woven wool covered cheeks and noses during storms, leaving only eyes visible. Breath crystallized in the air, a reminder that even a moment of exposed skin could turn fatal in sub-zero nights. The Vikings did not rely on clothing alone. Fires were portable weapons against cold. Small braziers were carried during hunting trips, warming hands and simmering small meals. Longhouses were filled with central hearths, smoke spiraling up through wooden beams, heating stone and clay walls. The combination of clothing, fire, and constant movement created a delicate balance. Stillness in the frost was dangerous. Yet clothing was more than survival, it was status, skill, and identity. A warrior's furs might signify wealth or raids survived. A woman's hand-woven tunics told of generations of knowledge, spun with understanding of winter's cruelty. Patterns, stitches, and layers reflected not vanity, but wisdom honed over decades of winters endured. When night fell and the wind howled, the Vikings huddled close, sharing warmth and stories. They were armored in fur and fire, yes, but also in community. Protection was not merely physical, it was mental, emotional, a shared resilience forged in frost. Against the darkest, coldest nights, the Vikings learned that survival required every tool, every layer, every ember, and above all, unyielding resolve. The night stretched long and merciless across the Viking homelands, stars sharp points in a sky that seemed impossibly dark. The cold was not an absence of heat, it was a presence pressing against walls, sneaking through cracks in wooden longhouses, crawling beneath furs, whispering at the edges of consciousness. And yet, amid the frost, the Vikings mastered fire like a weapon, a lifeline, a pulse of life against the endless night. In every longhouse, the hearth was the heart, its flames a sanctuary. Large stones cradled the fire, a mix of driftwood, oak, and resin-heavy pine, each log chosen for the way it burned, for the heat it gave, for the sparks it cast. Flames licked the ceiling beams, smoke curling through a central opening, carrying with it the smell of burning resin and wood, a scent as vital as bread or ale. Around the fire, families clustered, faces glowing red from heat, eyes bright despite exhaustion, hands pressed to the warmth, fingers tingling as frost receded. Fire was more than warmth, it was survival itself. For hunters returning from the frozen forests, it thawed stiff muscles and burned away the danger of hypothermia. For sailors returning from icy seas, it was the difference between life and death, a beacon in the darkness that promised safety. Even small embers, wrapped carefully in ash and carried from place to place, were sacred. To lose fire in a storm or in the tundra could mean wandering through a frozen grave. Vikings mastered the art of fire creation with flint and steel, striking sparks against iron like alchemists of survival. Tinder-dry moss, fine fibers from flax, birch bark caught sparks quickly, whispering to the wind, defying it. Once alight, the flame had to be nurtured, protected from drafts, fed with steady hands and patience. Fire was never taken for granted. It was a fragile ally, demanding respect and vigilance, a symbol of human cunning in the face of nature's cruelty. The longhouse itself was designed around fire. Benches, hearths, and platforms were arranged to capture maximum heat, stone floors storing warmth through the night. Smoke, carefully managed, preserved health while carrying away excess cold. Cooking, crafting, and gathering were rituals intertwined with fire. Meals were slow-cooked, simmered in heavy cauldrons, providing not just sustenance but concentrated heat to the room, food and warmth merging into a single defense against frost. At night, stories rose above the crackling blaze sagas of distant raids, gods who battled frost and fire alike, ancestors who endured when the world seemed impossible. Laughter and song mingled with smoke, forging a shield against the despair of cold, heat, light, community. These were as vital as axes and shields. The Vikings' fires were not merely physical, they were psychological, a beacon of hope, a proof of life, a challenge to winter itself. Against the darkness, the cold, the endless night, the flames burned stubborn, defiant, eternal. And those who huddled close, who tended the fire with care and patience, carried within them a truth as powerful as the warmth itself. In fire, the Vikings found strength. When the wind howled across the fjords and the snow settled thick on roofs and fields, the survival of a Viking family depended on more than furs and fire. It depended on food that could endure the harshest nights. Winter was not merely cold, it was a relentless opponent, a test of foresight, skill, and the discipline to store, prepare, and ration every bite. In longhouses, the scent of salted fish and smoked meat mingled with the smoky tang of resin-laden fire. Vikings had learned centuries ago that fresh meat and vegetables would not survive the frost, so they relied on preservation methods honed through necessity. Fish caught in icy rivers were salted, layered in barrels, and left to cure in cold pantries where the temperature hovered just above freezing. This wasn't merely storage, it was transformation, turning fragile food into a durable lifeline, each bite a triumph over winter's cruelty. Meat was treated with the same respect. Elk, deer, and cattle were butchered with care, cut into slabs, and smoked over low fires for days. The smoke infused the meat with both flavor and endurance, creating rations that could last through weeks of relentless cold. The Vikings understood the science of survival intuitively. Salt drew out moisture, smoke slowed decay, cold preserved it all, and the combination made winter nourishment possible. Grains and legumes were carefully stored in clay jars or woven baskets, placed in the corners of the longhouse where frost threatened least. Barley, oats, and dried peas provided the backbone of soups and stews, simmered slowly over the hearth, feeding the body while heating the air. These meals were simple, often bland to outsiders, but in the frozen nights they were sustenance and ritual, a daily defiance against the dark. But survival was not merely about food itself, it was about ingenuity. Vikings learned to stretch every resource. Bones and fish heads were boiled into broths rich in minerals. Leftover skins and organs were preserved for future use. Herbs, wild berries, and stored honey added taste and nutrition, a testament to knowing the land intimately. Every meal was planned, every bite accounted for, a delicate dance between hunger, warmth, and endurance. Even in the smallest settlements, families gathered around shared pots, each person taking their turn, stirring, tasting, and tending to the heat. Meals became ceremonies, brief moments of comfort and connection amid the unforgiving cold. Children learned to value each morsel, to respect the labor that had gone into every preserved fish and smoked slab. Food was power, warmth, and survival intertwined. Outside, snowdrifts could rise above the roofs, but inside, the hearth and the stores of preserved food allowed life to continue, to thrive, even when the world beyond was a frozen wasteland. The Vikings did not merely endure the cold, they mastered it, turning the night's darkness into a season of skill, patience, and careful preparation. In the quiet moments after a meal, as families huddled close to the fire, Vikings felt a small victory pulse through them. Against the frost, they were fed, warm, and alive. In food, as in fire, they found not just survival but defiance. In the dead of winter, the difference between life and death for a Viking could be measured in layers. The bitter cold that swept across the fjords did not merely bite, it gnawed, seeped into bones, and tested the body's endurance. Survival demanded more than a fire. It demanded an intimate knowledge of clothing, layering, and materials that insulated the body against the relentless frost. Vikings dressed for war against winter the same way they dressed for war at sea or on land, with strategy, precision, and practicality. Their first line of defense was linen, worn close to the skin, soft, breathable, and capable of wicking away moisture from sweat. Over linen came wool, dense and naturally water-resistant, woven into tunics, leggings, and socks that trapped heat while allowing movement. The layering was not arbitrary, each piece had a purpose. Moisture left next to the skin could freeze if trapped, so breathable fabrics kept the body dry, while wool retained warmth, even when snow clung to the outer layers. Furs were the crown of the Viking winter arsenal. Bear, fox, reindeer, and even otter pelts were selected for thickness, softness, and insulating properties. Cloaks draped over shoulders, hoods drawn tight over heads, mittens, and boots stuffed with straw or moss, all worked in unison to create a mobile fortress against the cold. Furs were more than protection. They were symbols of preparedness and status, showing skill in hunting or trade while serving a critical survival function. Hands and feet, the first to suffer frostbite, received special attention. Thick mittens were reinforced with leather, layered with fur, and occasionally lined with soft cloth. Boots were crafted from tanned hides, often double-layered, stuffed with insulating material, and fastened tightly to keep out snow and wind. Walking across frozen rivers or through deep drifts became a calculated effort, each step cushioned, protected, and deliberate. Even hairstyles had a purpose. Long hair, often braided, acted as an additional layer of insulation for the neck and head. Beards were practical, catching breath moisture and preventing it from chilling the skin beneath. Vikings understood that nature was a ruthless opponent. Every strand, every layer, every choice of fabric contributed to survival. Nightfall brought new challenges. Inside longhouses, furs were used not only as clothing, but as bedding, creating pockets of warmth in the sleeping quarters. Families huddled together, layering skins and blankets to conserve heat, sharing body warmth while listening to the wind howl outside. Children learned early how to arrange clothing and blankets, understanding that carelessness could mean frostbite or worse. Layering was more than physical protection, it was a mental discipline. Every garment represented preparation, foresight, and defiance. In the frozen north, those who respected the cold and dressed accordingly survived. Those who underestimated it suffered. To the Vikings, clothing was armor, a silent shield against the endless nights, and mastery over it was mastery over the elements themselves. By sunrise, when the frost sparkled like crystal across the landscape, the Vikings stepped out into the world armored in fur, wool, and leather. They did not merely survive the cold, they defied it, moving through ice and snow like creatures born of the frozen lands themselves. The coldest nights, left the land cloaked in white, transforming familiar forests, rivers, and fjords into alien landscapes. Survival for the Vikings meant more than layering in furs. It demanded food, and food required daring ventures into a frozen world. Hunting and fishing in deep winter was a test of patience, skill, and endurance, where a single misstep could mean returning empty-handed or worse. Hunting in the snow was both art and necessity. Tracks in the frost told stories, revealing the movements of deer, elk, and small game. Vikings read the land like a living map, noticing the subtle disturbances in snow, the broken branches, the indentations left by creatures seeking shelter. Snares, traps, and carefully concealed pits were placed with precision. Each device had to withstand frost and ice without losing sensitivity. A frozen trigger could mean disaster. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, patience was paramount. Hunters waited for hours in hidden spots, faces, and hands wrapped in furs. Eyes scanning the whiteness, muscles tense and ready. When larger game was scarce, smaller animals became crucial. Rabbits, hares, and birds were trapped with cunning ingenuity. Snow-covered nets and camouflaged pits ensured that no movement was wasted. The goal was not sport, it was survival, every capture feeding families through the long, merciless months. Fishing presented its own challenges. Rivers slowed, lakes thickened with ice, and the ocean became a hostile, roiling expanse of snow-choked waves. Ice fishing required courage. Holes were carved in frozen surfaces, sometimes under the threat of snowstorms that could erase paths or hide dangerous thin ice. Nets, lines, and hooks were used strategically. Fish were lured with patience and understanding of water behavior beneath the ice. Small catches could feed a household for days, salted or smoked to preserve them against further frost. Seafaring Vikings adapted differently. Longships braved icy waters, their crews wrapped in furs and skins, relying on both skill and the mercy of the sea. Cod, herring, and salmon were taken in abundance, often in dangerous winter conditions where waves crashed over decks and frost coated every surface. Every fish brought back was precious. It was protein, fuel for strength, and insurance against starvation. Hunting and fishing were communal endeavors. Villagers shared knowledge of good spots, aided one another in heavy snow, and traded meat, fish, and preserved food. Survival was not solitary, it relied on networks of family and community. Young hunters learned from elders, absorbing techniques and instincts honed over generations. In these lessons lay not just food security, but the culture of endurance and resilience that defined Viking life. Through the long nights and frozen days, the Vikings became masters of the winter landscape. They read tracks in the snow, felt the pulse of rivers beneath ice, and moved with a quiet confidence born from experience. Each successful hunt or fish-filled net was a triumph over the merciless cold, a testament to human ingenuity and courage in a world that tested every limit. In frost and snow, life endured, and the Vikings, relentless, persistent, and shrewd, ensured it did. While hunting and fishing kept Viking families alive, it was foraging and food preservation that determined whether a household would endure the dead of winter. The cold months were merciless, and every berry, root, and herb gathered during the fleeting warmth of late summer and early autumn became a lifeline. Vikings understood that survival was as much about planning and preparation as it was about courage on frozen fields and seas. The forests and hills still held life beneath the snow. Hardier roots, bulbs, and tubers were dug from frozen earth, often requiring iron spades and steady hands. Lingonberries and cranberries, tart and resilient, were gathered before frost set in, then stored in cellars or woven baskets, coated in straw to prevent freezing. Nuts and seeds collected from forests were not just food, they were energy reserves, small pockets of warmth in the harsh winter days. Each meal became a careful calculation, rationed to ensure that resources lasted until spring. Mushrooms, though scarce in winter, were preserved for medicinal and culinary purposes. Some were dried, others pickled in brine or fermented to last months. Even mosses and lichens were utilized when scarcity pressed hard, boiled or mixed with grains to supplement otherwise meager meals. Knowledge of what was safe to eat and what could be preserved was passed down orally, a combination of folk wisdom and survival instinct. Mistakes could be fatal, and the fear of misidentifying poisonous plants was never far from mind. Preservation techniques became a matter of life and death. Meat and fish, caught during the winter hunt or late fall, were smoked over open fires or salted in barrels to resist spoilage. Fat was rendered and stored in clay jars, a versatile resource for cooking and warmth. Grains and legumes were dried thoroughly, sometimes sun-dried before the frost, then stored in cool, dry cellars insulated from ice. Vikings recognized that without careful preservation, even the richest harvest could vanish in weeks under the relentless cold. Trade also supplemented what could be foraged locally. Coastal settlements exchanged salted fish, dried berries, and smoked meats with inland villages. These networks ensured that scarcity in one region did not necessarily spell disaster, and they reinforced the importance of community and cooperation. Even foraging was not a solitary endeavor. Families often ventured together into the snow-laden forests, children learning to recognize edible plants, elders teaching the subtleties of preservation. Every berry picked and every root stored was a small victory, a quiet act of defiance against the winter's grip. Through these careful preparations, the Vikings transformed scarcity into security. The cold was still relentless, but the combination of foresight, knowledge, and disciplined preservation meant that hunger did not dominate their lives. Winter could be harsh, cruel, and punishing, but in every jar of preserved meat, every basket of berries, and every barrel of salted fish, the Vikings asserted control over the environment, bending it to their will without ever breaking their connection to the land. In the coldest months, the people of the north survived not just through strength, but through wisdom, patience, and the quiet power of preparation. In the dead of winter, when icy winds tore through the fjords and snow blanketed the land, Viking survival depended as much on shelter and fire as it did on food. Houses were more than buildings, they were lifelines, fortresses against the cold, sanctuaries where families could gather and endure the harshest nights. Vikings understood that warmth was not a luxury, it was survival. Longhouses were the centerpiece of their winter strategy. Built from timber, stone, and sod, these structures were designed to retain heat, withstand snow, and protect against the cutting winds. Smoke from central hearths curled through openings in the roof, filling the room with warmth and the scent of burning wood. Straw mats, furs, and layered textiles insulated sleeping areas, creating pockets of heat for families and livestock alike. Even the positioning of the house mattered, often built on slightly elevated ground to avoid damp and cold air pooling in low areas. The hearth was sacred. It was more than a place to cook, it was the heart of the home. Flames crackled, casting shadows across timber beams, while pots of stews simmered slowly over embers. Food, warmth, and light converged in one glowing center. Each household member contributed, collecting wood, stoking the fire, and ensuring that the flames never faltered through the night. Failure to maintain the fire could be fatal. Frostbite, hypothermia, or weakened immunity awaited those who neglected it. Vikings also relied on communal warmth. Villages were tight-knit, and neighbors often gathered in shared spaces when blizzards raged. Stories were told by firelight, songs sung, and lessons passed down. The old taught the young about survival, the rhythms of the seasons, and the stories of their ancestors. This shared heat and community spirit was as important as the fire itself, reinforcing bonds that would later prove critical in times of famine or attack. Even livestock played a role. Animals were brought inside or into adjacent shelters, their bodies radiating heat that helped warm living spaces. Furs, hides, and wool were layered across floors and benches, capturing warmth that would otherwise escape. Every measure, no matter how small, contributed to the household's overall survival. Vikings knew that the cold could not be fought with brute force alone. It required ingenuity, discipline, and an understanding of the natural world. Fire needed kindling and fuel. Houses required maintenance and foresight. Those who ignored these truths did not survive. Those who mastered them thrived, their longhouses glowing like beacons against the frozen darkness. In the long, frozen nights, the warmth of fire and community sustained the Vikings. It protected them from the merciless cold, allowed their bodies to rest, and their minds to plan for the next day. In every flicker of flame, every shared story, and every layered fur, the people of the North asserted control over an environment that demanded respect and skill. Fire was survival. Shelter was survival. Together, they were the shield against a winter that sought to break them. When the North's icy breath descended, Vikings did not cower. They dressed for war against winter itself. Survival depended on clothing as much as courage. The frigid nights demanded layers, furs, and ingenuity, transforming the human body into its own fortress against frost and snow. Viking clothing was practical, designed with an intimate understanding of the cold. Linen and wool formed the base layers, soft against the skin, insulating against drafts while allowing mobility. Over these, heavier woolen tunics and cloaks were thrown, often pinned with brooches at the shoulders. But it was the furs that made the difference between enduring a blizzard and succumbing to it. Bear, fox, reindeer, and seal furs were prized not just for warmth, but for their ability to trap body heat and repel biting winds. The fur-lined hood, known as a kapuze, could be drawn over the head, leaving only a narrow slit for vision, cutting wind and frostbite alike. Layering was an art. Vikings understood that trapped air between garments became insulation. Multiple tunics, cloaks, leggings, and mittens were arranged to maximize this effect, with each layer serving a distinct purpose. Wool socks were tucked inside leather boots, sometimes lined with fur or straw. Gloves were often reinforced with leather, but beneath, softer fur kept fingers nimble and warm. Every inch of exposed skin increased the risk of frostbite, so scarves, hoods, and face coverings were essential. Hunting and raiding in winter required adaptations beyond clothing. Leather belts and straps were used to secure pouches and tools without sacrificing warmth. Fur-lined capes doubled as blankets when sleeping outdoors. Those travelling long distances across snow-laden landscapes carried packs of extra furs and spare layers, ready to swap damp garments for dry ones. Failure to do so could prove deadly in a world where snowstorms could appear without warning. Vikings also understood the importance of keeping clothes dry. Wet fabric robbed the body of heat faster than exposure alone. Fires were central not just for warmth, but for drying garments. Families and villages would rotate clothing near hearths, hanging furs and woolens to absorb heat without scorching the fibers. Even in raids or journeys, care was taken to shelter clothing from snow or freezing rain. Survival often came down to small details: a dry sock, a windproof cloak, a well-wrapped child. Adornment played a subtle role too. Brooches, beads, and sewn patterns weren't purely decorative. They helped fasten layers securely, ensuring no wind could penetrate. Function and beauty intertwined, reflecting a culture that treated clothing as both armor and identity. Through this armor of furs and layers, Vikings faced winter not as victims, but as warriors. Every garment, every fold of fur, every secured strap was a shield against frost and snow. Survival wasn't luck, it was preparation, knowledge, and respect for the cold. In the deepest darkness of the North, Vikings wore their resilience, their ingenuity, and their defiance like a second skin. Against the frozen nights, they were armored, unstoppable, alive. In the dead of winter, when snow blanketed the fjords and frost coated every surface, survival for the Vikings depended as much on what was inside their bellies as on the layers wrapped around their bodies. The cold was merciless, and energy burned rapidly. To endure the longest nights, Vikings had to eat strategically, preserving strength through warmth, sustenance, and ritual. Preservation was a science born of necessity. Fresh meat was scarce in the frozen months, so Vikings relied heavily on drying, smoking, and salting to extend its life. Fish caught from icy rivers or the sea became a lifeline. Herring and cod were salted and hung in smoke-filled sheds, their pungent aroma a promise of nourishment when the snow fell too deep for hunting. Meat from domesticated animals, pigs, goats, sheep, and cattle, was carefully butchered, salted, and stored in barrels or hung from rafters. Every scrap was utilized, fat rendered into tallow, bones boiled for broth, and skins preserved for warmth or trade. Grains and vegetables were stored in root cellars dug into the earth or built beneath longhouses. Barley, rye, and oats became porridge, hearty breads, and ale. Root vegetables, such as turnips, carrots, and cabbages, survived underground, sometimes coated with straw or earth to prevent freezing. Even in the heart of winter, a table could be made full with the labor and foresight of warmer months. But food was more than survival, it was fuel. The Vikings understood that digestion generated heat, a small army of warmth within the body. Thick stews cooked over open hearths filled the longhouse with both scent and steam, warding off frostbite and despair. Ale, brewed in summer and stored in barrels, provided warmth and energy. Its alcohol, though modest in concentration, lifted spirits while the body fought the cold. Fires were carefully tended to ensure continuous cooking and drying of food, their glow a companion to the long nights. Communal meals were also a bond against isolation. Families, neighbors, and warriors gathered around fires, sharing the fruits of months of labor. Stories were told, songs hummed, and plans whispered. Eating was not merely functional, it reinforced connection and morale, keeping the spirit as strong as the body. Even small children were taught to eat sparingly but wisely, learning early that survival meant conserving resources while sustaining energy. Foraging supplemented stored supplies. Berries, nuts, and herbs still clung stubbornly to branches, and skilled Vikings knew how to find them under snow. Mushrooms were harvested in brief thaws, dried, and stored for flavor and nutrition. The cold dictated ingenuity. Food preparation became a daily strategy, and the success of each meal could tip the balance between endurance and exhaustion. Thus, in the frosted longhouses and along the snow-swept fjords, Vikings faced winter not in hunger, but in preparation. Every preserved fish, every barrel of grain, every steaming pot of stew was a testament to human ingenuity. The cold was relentless, yet they persisted. With fire, foresight, and shared sustenance, they kept the blood flowing, the body warm, and the spirit unbroken. In every bite, in every gathering around the hearth, the Vikings declared silently but powerfully, they would survive the night and every night after. As winter tightened its grip over the northern lands, the Viking longhouse became more than a home. It was a fortress against the relentless cold. The longhouses, long and narrow, were architectural marvels of adaptation, built to hold families, livestock, and fire under one roof. Each beam, thatch, and stone was carefully chosen to withstand wind, frost, and snowstorms that could strip flesh from bone if one ventured outside unprepared. Construction began with timber, often oak, dense and strong, hand-hewn into beams and posts. The frame was meticulously joined with wooden pegs, a method that allowed the structure to shift slightly under snow load without collapsing. Walls were reinforced with wattle-woven branches coated in mud or clay to seal gaps against the biting wind. In wealthier households, stone foundations added both stability and insulation, keeping the interior temperature far higher than the frozen ground outside. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow, covered in layers of reeds or turf. These natural materials weren't merely for cover, they trapped heat like a thick quilt, forming an insulating barrier over the household. Turf roofs also absorbed water during winter rains, slowly releasing it, preventing ice dams that could collapse the structure. Vikings understood that a poorly built roof could mean death in midwinter. Their designs weren't ornamental, they were life-saving. Inside, the longhouse was centered around the hearth. A large fire pit in the middle of the hall radiated heat to every corner, the smoke spiraling upward and escaping through a hole in the roof or a short chimney. The hearth was not just for warmth, but for cooking, brewing, and boiling water, all critical to survival. Firewood was stored strategically near the walls, ensuring a steady supply even in storms that trapped men indoors for days. Furnishings were minimal but purposeful. Raised platforms along the walls served as beds, often layered with furs for insulation. Animal skins, thick blankets of wool, and straw bedding created microclimates of warmth. The Vikings slept in groups, their bodies pressed together to share heat, demonstrating an intimate understanding of communal survival. Livestock often stayed inside during the coldest nights, their body heat radiating into the living space, adding another layer of warmth. Windows, if present, were tiny and sometimes covered with animal hide, reducing drafts while still allowing minimal light. Doors were thick, often double-layered, preventing icy gusts from sneaking inside. Even the floor was considered. Packed earth or wood planks were insulated with straw or furs, keeping the chill from seeping upward. Every detail of the longhouse was a calculated defense against the elements. These homes were more than shelter, they were life support systems, designed with precision, experience, and respect for nature's cruelty. Inside, the family was shielded, the hearth glowing, and the air filled with warmth and the smell of food, smoke, and human presence. Outside, winter howled, but inside, life endured. Through these longhouses, Vikings demonstrated a principle as critical as courage in battle or skill in navigation. Preparation and ingenuity were as vital as bravery. Against the coldest nights, they built walls of warmth, proving that human determination and intelligence could turn even a frozen world into a sanctuary. When the wind sliced across the fjords and snow fell in relentless sheets, the Viking warrior and farmer alike relied on clothing as their first line of defense. Survival in the frigid north wasn't a matter of toughness alone. It required strategy, knowledge, and layers designed to trap heat and repel moisture. Each garment was a calculated shield against frostbite, hypothermia, and the merciless bite of winter. At the base, Vikings wore linen or woolen undergarments that hugged the body, creating a barrier against the cold while wicking away sweat. Linen was light, breathable, and dried quickly, preventing moisture from lingering near the skin, which could turn deadly in freezing temperatures. Over this, woolen tunics and trousers were added. Wool, naturally insulating and resilient, held warmth even when damp, making it ideal for the unpredictable northern climate. Each layer was deliberate, a mix of practicality and resourceful adaptation to nature's cruelty. Outerwear was the armor of survival. Cloaks of heavy wool, often lined with fur, draped over shoulders, and were fastened with brooches carved from bone, bronze, or silver. These cloaks shielded the body from wind and snow, their weight and thickness a deterrent against frost. In the coldest months, furs were worn directly against the body. Reindeer, fox, and seal furs were prized for their insulating properties. The fur traps air, creating pockets of warmth, while the dense outer coat sheds moisture and snow, keeping the wearer dry and alive. Feet and hands were particularly vulnerable. Wool socks were layered beneath leather shoes or boots, often stuffed with straw for added insulation. Mittens, sometimes layered, kept fingers nimble despite frost and icy winds. Heads and ears were covered with hoods or fur-lined caps, the first point of heat loss in the body carefully guarded. Even the throat, a critical conduit for warmth, was shielded with scarves of wool or fur. Every inch mattered. Survival was measured in degrees, and the smallest exposure could prove fatal. For Vikings who ventured onto the frozen seas or through snow-laden forests, waterproofing became essential. Leather, treated with animal fat or tallow, created a barrier against icy water and damp snow. Thick leather gloves protected hands during long hours of chopping wood or hauling cargo, while boots reinforced with leather soles kept feet from freezing to ice. Clothing was not merely functional, it signified status, skill, and the ability to endure hardship. A finely woven cloak or carefully stitched pair of boots demonstrated mastery over one's environment and resources. But every piece, no matter how humble, served the same essential purpose: survival. In villages, towns, and on the open seas, Vikings layered, wrapped, and fortified themselves against winter's merciless advance. Each garment was a lifeline, each layer a calculated decision between life and death. While battles were fought with sword and shield, the fiercest struggle was often against the cold itself, and in that fight, knowledge, ingenuity, and preparation were the mightiest weapons. The Viking body, wrapped in furs and wool, became a fortress of flesh and fibre. Against the coldest nights, these layers were not just clothing, they were armour, protection, and proof that human ingenuity could withstand even the harshest forces of nature. In the frozen north, where night fell early and frost clung to every surface, fire was more than comfort, it was survival. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Long before alarm clocks or stoves, they mastered the art of gathering, creating, and sustaining heat, turning flame into a lifeline against the coldest nights. A hearth was the heart of a home, its flickering glow a constant reminder that even in the harshest winters, warmth could be commanded. Inside longhouses, massive central hearths burned steadily, fed by split logs of pine, birch, or oak. Smoke rose through holes in the roof, and the walls, lined with reeds and animal hides, trapped heat like a natural insulator. Every stone around the fire radiated warmth long after the flames had died down. Families huddled close, sharing body heat while the fire did the heavy lifting. It was a delicate balance. Too little wood and frost crept in through cracks, too much, and the air became suffocating. For those living in smaller outposts or on the open tundra, fire demanded ingenuity. Vikings carried embers in iron containers, a portable heartbeat of warmth that could ignite new fires when needed. Torches and braziers were strategically placed, lighting pathways and protecting livestock from freezing. In long journeys, fires were dug into snow pits, insulated with stones and covered with branches, primitive stoves that reflected both light and heat, keeping frost at bay. Beyond providing warmth, fire served as a tool of survival. It cooked the starchy root vegetables, dried fish, and preserved meats that would otherwise spoil in the damp cold. Smoke from these fires helped repel insects and animals, while controlled flames kept wolves and other predators at a distance. Every flicker was a safeguard, a quiet declaration that humans, no matter the severity of nature's grip, could thrive. Vikings also turned fire into ritual and community. Nightly gatherings around the hearth weren't solely practical, they were social anchors. Tales of gods and giants, of sea voyages and battles, were told and retold, their heat and intensity matched by the flames before them. Singing, drumming, and storytelling fused with the firelight, embedding warmth into memory, courage, and collective strength. The hearth became both body and spirit protection. Even in winter raids, Vikings used fire strategically. Signal fires on hills communicated movements across frozen valleys, while controlled torches allowed safe navigation of snow-blinded landscapes. Fire was knowledge, a weapon, and a shield. It transformed the impossible, turning snow-choked nights into survivable landscapes. Through meticulous control of flame, the Vikings conquered more than territory, they mastered the cold itself. Every ember, every spark, was a choice, a decision that balanced risk and reward. In a world where frost could end life with quiet cruelty, fire was the ultimate ally. It was warmth, security, and survival in a single, roaring package. For the Viking people, winter was not endured passively. It was faced head-on, met with layers, embers, and ingenuity. The fire didn't just burn, it defended, fed, and preserved life, proving that even in the darkest, coldest nights, human resolve could ignite a light that frost could never fully extinguish. When the wind howled across the northern fjords and snow fell in blinding sheets, survival depended on shelter. The Vikings were master builders, shaping the harsh environment into defenses against nature's fury. Their longhouses and huts were more than dwellings. They were fortresses, carefully engineered to resist blizzards, freezing rains, and icy gales that could snap unprepared travelers like twigs. The first line of defense was structure. Viking longhouses were elongated, low to the ground, and often partially embedded into hillsides to protect against the wind. Thick walls of timber, stone, and sod acted as insulation, trapping heat and creating layers that frost struggled to penetrate. Roofs, steeply pitched and covered with turf, allowed snow to slide off instead of accumulating and collapsing the beams. Every plank, every layer of thatch or sod was positioned with precision, a marriage of practicality and ingenuity honed over generations. Inside, design mattered just as much as materials. The central hearth provided warmth, but smoke was not allowed to suffocate the inhabitants. Small vents channeled it upward, while thick curtains or animal hides partitioned rooms to retain heat. Sleeping platforms were elevated, lifting bodies above the icy floor and closer to the warmth of the fire. Each family member had a designated spot, maximizing body heat and limiting exposure. Even the smallest details, like the direction of doorways or the placement of windows, were dictated by the prevailing winds, ensuring the house itself could block the worst of winter's assault. Outside, Vikings built auxiliary defenses, snow walls, windbreaks, and even piles of brush around homes redirected biting gusts, softening their force before they could reach walls and doors. Livestock, essential for both food and clothing, were sheltered in attached stalls, their body heat contributing to the overall warmth of the dwelling. Every element, from human to animal to earth, worked together as a unified system of survival. Vikings on long journeys or in temporary camps faced even harsher conditions. Tents made from animal hides were reinforced with wooden stakes, and pits were dug to trap the body's heat. Fires were surrounded by stone walls, or dug into shallow trenches to prevent flames from being snuffed by wind. Ingenious layering of hides and branches provided insulation where permanent structures were impossible, proving that mobility and protection could coexist. Even in the darkest storms, Viking shelters were not just functional, they fostered resilience and community. Families huddled close, stories were shared, and plans were forged for the coming day. The act of survival became a daily ritual, a reminder that preparation, knowledge, and cooperation were as vital as strength or courage. Through careful construction and an intimate understanding of the northern landscape, Vikings transformed fragile materials into strongholds. In their homes, the blizzard outside could rage and howl, but inside there was warmth, security, and the quiet assurance that they had built not just shelters, but lifelines. When winter struck with icy hands, the Vikings knew that survival depended on foresight. The fjords froze, the forests lay heavy with snow, and hunting became perilous. To endure the coldest nights, the Vikings turned to methods of preservation that could sustain them through months of darkness and scarcity. Salt, smoke, and fermentation were their weapons against hunger. Fish, abundant along the coasts, formed the backbone of winter sustenance. Herring, cod, and salmon were gutted and strung on wooden racks, left to dry in the crisp northern air. The wind, harsh yet cleansing, stripped moisture from the flesh, creating stockpiles that could last months. Some fish were smoked over slow-burning fires, infusing them with flavor while sealing them against spoilage. The scent of smoky fish hung heavy in the villages, a reminder that survival demanded preparation long before snow covered the ground. Meat was treated with equal care. Herded livestock, cows, sheep, goats were slaughtered strategically, never all at once, ensuring a balance between immediate food needs and future security. Meat was salted in wooden barrels, cured to withstand the freezing temperatures. In some regions, the cold itself became a natural preservative. The Vikings hung meat outdoors, letting the frost keep predators away while locking in freshness. No animal was wasted, bones were used for tools, hides for clothing, and even offal for fertilizer. Efficiency was survival. Grains and root vegetables were stored in earthen pits or elevated granaries, protected from both moisture and frost. Barley, rye, and oats formed the foundation of breads and porridge, while turnips, cabbage, and onions provided essential nutrients through the darkest months. The Vikings understood fermentation not just as a culinary craft, but as a method of preservation. Sauerkraut and fermented dairy products added vitamins to a diet otherwise dominated by starchy staples, keeping scurvy and malnutrition at bay. Honey and dried fruits supplemented the monotony of winter meals, their sweetness a small comfort against the relentless cold. Every food item was accounted for, every barrel and basket carefully monitored. In some households, the act of checking supplies became a ritual, inspecting meat, tasting fermented fish, measuring grain reserves, a daily reminder that survival required constant vigilance. Community played a crucial role. Villagers pooled resources, sharing stockpiles and coordinating hunts, ensuring that no family faced the winter entirely alone. Knowledge was passed from parent to child, the timing of harvests, the methods of curing, the tricks of drying fish or making cheese, all vital lore for enduring months when the world outside was frozen solid. By combining ingenuity with an intimate understanding of the environment, the Vikings created a food system that could outlast storms, blizzards, and famine. They turned scarcity into strategy, relying on preservation not as convenience, but as lifeline. In the darkest nights, when snow buried the earth and wind whipped through the village, their cellars, smokehouses, and granaries were more than storage. They were the difference between life and death, a testament to Viking resourcefulness and unyielding will. The bitter northern wind spared no one. In the long, dark winters, temperatures could plummet far below freezing, and survival demanded more than resilience. It demanded armor woven from wool, fur, and leather. For the Vikings, clothing was not merely decoration, it was protection, a carefully layered system designed to trap warmth and shield against relentless cold. The base layer, worn next to the skin, was spun from soft wool. Vikings prized its natural insulating properties and its ability to wick away moisture from sweat, keeping the body dry and preventing hypothermia. Coarse linen was sometimes added in warmer regions or seasons, but in the heart of winter, wool was king. Each tunic and pair of trousers was meticulously stitched, sometimes dyed with local plants, but always functional, cut to allow movement for work, hunting, and travel. Layering was essential. Over the base, Vikings added thicker woolen garments or cloaks, often lined with animal furs. Reindeer, fox, and even bear pelts were harvested and sewn into coats and wraps. These layers formed a barrier against the wind and trapped body heat close to the skin. Hoods and capes were standard, their fur-lined edges protecting ears, necks, and cheeks from frostbite. Gloves, mittens, and boots, reinforced with leather and fur, ensured fingers and toes remained alive with warmth, vital when traversing snow-laden forests or icy riverbanks. Headgear was particularly important. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between survival and frostbite. Some wealthier Vikings adorned their helmets with fur linings or cheek flaps, practical additions that also reflected status. Scarves, woven from thick fibers, were wrapped around faces, shielding delicate skin from snow, sleet, and the biting cold. No part of the body was left exposed. Survival demanded total coverage. Footwear was another critical consideration. Thick leather boots, sometimes stuffed with moss or wool, kept feet insulated. Snow could easily penetrate thinner shoes, and wet feet meant rapid loss of body heat. Vikings learned to waterproof leather with oils and animal fats, techniques passed down through generations. Traveling in snowshoes or reinforced boots, hunters and warriors could cross frozen rivers or trek long distances without succumbing to the cold. The genius of Viking clothing lay not only in the materials, but in the adaptability. Layers could be added or removed as temperatures fluctuated, and clothing could be repaired with relative ease. Simple stitching, patches of fur, and waterproofing ensured garments endured harsh winters for years. Beyond practicality, clothing held social and cultural significance. Fur trims, embroidered patterns, and dyed fabrics distinguished clans and families, even in the dead of winter. Yet function always triumphed over fashion. Warmth was survival, beauty secondary. When the wind howled through fjords and snow blanketed the landscape, Vikings did not merely endure, they thrived. Each layer of wool and fur was a shield. The longhouse was the heart of Viking life, a shelter against a relentless northern winter. Outside, snow drifted in sheets, the wind rattling trees and rattling rooftops, but inside, warmth and light battled the darkness. The hearth was the center, a roaring fire built carefully in the middle of the structure, its smoke rising through a central opening in the roof. It was more than comfort, it was survival. Fuel was essential. Wood was the lifeblood of the fire, harvested from nearby forests and stored in barns and sheds, stacked high to withstand the long months of scarcity. Birch, oak, and pine provided different qualities of heat. Oak burned slow and steady, birch flared quickly but faded fast. Pine sparked and crackled, filling the longhouse with a comforting scent. Even driftwood or peat was used when timber ran low. Every scrap of burnable material was precious. Without fire, a longhouse became a tomb in winter. Fire placement required skill. In smaller houses, a single hearth sufficed, but larger homes, where families and livestock coexisted under one roof, demanded careful planning. The fire's heat had to reach all corners, warming sleeping areas and workspaces. Stones were often placed around the hearth, absorbing and radiating heat long after the flames had died down. Some homes had clay or earthen stoves, primitive but effective innovations that allowed controlled heat to last through the night. Smoke management was another challenge. Too little ventilation meant suffocating interiors, too much allowed precious heat to escape. Vikings mastered a balance. The central hole allowed smoke to rise, while strategically placed gaps and doors guided airflow. Even in the thick of winter, the longhouse could breathe without freezing its inhabitants. The fire was also a social anchor. Families huddled around it, sharing stories, meals, and warmth. Meals cooked over the flames were essential calories, sustaining the body through harsh conditions. The crackle and roar of burning wood became a rhythm of survival, a pulse of life in an unforgiving climate. Night after night, flames illuminated the carved wooden walls, casting shadows that danced with each flicker. Long nights demanded preparation. Even when tending the fire, Vikings slept in layers close to the hearth. Benches or platforms were lined with furs, and children snuggled between parents, sharing body heat. Water was heated for washing and meals, steam rising into the smoky air, creating a fragile sanctuary of comfort against the cold. The fire was also practical. It protected against frostbite and illness, a barrier against hypothermia. A cold night without warmth could be deadly, and Vikings treated their hearths with almost religious respect, tending embers and saving coals for the morning. To extinguish the fire was unthinkable. To mismanage it was folly. In the frozen lands of the north, survival was forged in heat. Every spark, every log, every ember mattered. The longhouse fire was a lifeline, a symbol of human resilience against the cold. It was the heartbeat of the home, a shield against winter's cruelty, and proof that even in the harshest nights, Vikings had mastered the art of keeping warmth alive. When the snow blanketed the northern forests and fjords, survival demanded more than a warm hearth. It demanded skill, endurance, and courage. The Vikings knew this better than anyone. Winter hunting was a deadly dance, with the cold and with nature itself, where every misstep could mean starvation or death. The forests were hushed, the air sharp and biting, and the tracks in snow told stories. Wolves, deer, and elk moved with precision, leaving trails that experienced eyes could read like a map. Hunters donned layers of wool and fur, their faces partially covered to shield against frostbite. They moved silently, bows in hand, axes slung over shoulders, sometimes walking for miles to reach hunting grounds rich in game. Every journey into the snow was calculated. Misjudging the weather or the animal's path could be fatal. The bow was a lifeline. Crafted from yew, ash, or elm, it was flexible yet strong, capable of launching arrows accurately even through swirling snow. Hunters carried quivers lined with fletched arrows, tips hardened over fire or sharpened with flint. Some relied on spears for larger game, or traps and snares set along well-worn paths. Every tool had a purpose, honed through generations of experience. Fishing remained crucial too, even when rivers were partially frozen. Holes were cut through ice, and lines baited with worms or fish scraps were dropped into the frigid water. Nets were sometimes set under ice or along riverbanks, catching the hardy fish that could survive the cold. Salted and dried, these fish became staples, carried back to the longhouse to supplement meat and preserve the fragile balance of nutrition. Foraging was equally vital. Roots, nuts, and preserved berries stored from autumn were carefully rationed. Seaweed, harvested from the frozen coastlines, added essential minerals. Even snow itself was utilized, melted over the hearth for drinking water when streams froze. Every resource was accounted for. Waste was unthinkable. Hunting in winter was not only about survival, it was also a test of cunning and courage. Predators roamed the forests, and a lone elk or deer could turn aggressive if cornered. Hunters had to read the land and the weather simultaneously, predicting blizzards or icy winds that could trap them miles from safety. Companions often worked in small groups, watching each other's backs, their shared knowledge turning deadly forests into manageable territory. Back at the longhouse, the bounty of the hunt was celebrated, but also scrutinized. Meat was trimmed, cut into strips, and either salted or smoked to last the harsh months. Hides were tanned for clothing and bedding, and bones were repurposed for tools or decoration. Every part of an animal had a role, a testament to the Vikings' efficiency and respect for life. Winter hunting was grueling, but it forged resilience. Those who braved the cold returned not only with food, but with the assurance that survival was possible. The frozen forests tested every skill, every instinct, every ounce of determination. Yet in these bitter nights, the Vikings thrived, proving that even the harshest winter could be endured with knowledge, courage, and unyielding resolve. In the bitter northern winters, when the wind howled like a pack of wolves and the frost bit through even the thickest layers, the Viking longhouse became both sanctuary and fortress. Every design choice, every material, every craft honed over generations was about one thing: survival. Longhouses were massive, wooden structures, often lined with stone at the base to resist rot and the creeping cold. Roofs were steeply pitched, thatched with reeds or covered in layers of turf, the earth itself insulating against snow and icy winds. Smoke holes at the top allowed the hearth's warmth to rise and circulate, while carefully placed doors and small openings kept drafts at bay. Inside, the walls were adorned with animal skins, thick furs, and tapestries woven from wool, all serving as layers of thermal armor against winter's assault. The heart of the home was the hearth. Fire wasn't just comfort, it was life. Birch, oak, and pine logs were stacked with precision, kindling carefully chosen to burn slow and hot. The smoke danced through the roof hole, carrying heat throughout the longhouse and keeping the bitter air from settling inside. Around the fire, families gathered, sharing food, tending infants, and crafting tools or clothing. The hearth's glow was the line between survival and succumbing to the cold. Clothing mirrored the ingenuity of the architecture. Vikings dressed in layers, starting with linen or wool undergarments that absorbed moisture and retained warmth. Over this, tunics and trousers made of wool or animal hides trapped body heat, while cloaks of sheepskin, seal, or reindeer fur shielded them from wind and snow. Boots were reinforced with leather and often stuffed with straw for insulation, and gloves, mittens, and hoods were meticulously crafted to prevent frostbite. Every stitch, every seam, every overlapping layer was a calculated defense against the night's fury. Even bedding was engineered for endurance. Thick furs covered raised wooden platforms, keeping sleepers above the cold stone floors. Pillows were stuffed with feathers or hay, and blankets layered in alternating skins and woven fabrics trapped warmth. Sleeping close together was both practical and symbolic. Families sharing heat, sharing vigilance against the unforgiving climate outside. The Vikings also understood that preparation began long before snow fell. Hides were cured in the autumn, wool was spun and dyed, and tools were repaired to ensure no one faced the storm without proper protection. The knowledge of textiles, tanning, and insulation was passed from parent to child, a vital skill set that dictated life or death during the harshest months. Even the smallest details mattered. Roof eaves were extended to prevent snow from collapsing walls. Doors were fitted tightly with wooden latches, and hearth smoke was carefully managed to avoid extinguishing in blizzards. Life in the longhouse was a continuous negotiation, with winter every moment measured, every action intentional. Through these strategies, the Vikings transformed their homes and clothing into shields against the cold. The frost outside raged, the nights lengthened, yet inside the longhouse life persisted. Warmth was preserved, food was shared, and families endured together. In mastering these defenses, the Vikings revealed a deeper truth. Survival in the north wasn't about brute strength alone, it was about ingenuity, careful preparation, and respect for the relentless power of nature. In the long, brutal winters of the north, survival depended as much on what went into the body as on what protected it. For the Vikings, food wasn't merely nourishment, it was armor against frost, a means of fueling strength, endurance, and resilience when the sun barely rose and the nights stretched endlessly. Preparation began long before the snow fell. Autumn hunts were crucial. Deer, elk, and wild boar were trapped, slaughtered, and preserved with meticulous care. Salting, smoking, and drying meat allowed it to last for months, ready to provide warmth and energy when fresh game was scarce. Fish from the rivers and the sea salmon, herring, cod were similarly salted and stored in barrels, becoming staples of the winter diet. Dried fish and meat were not just food, they were a lifeline, high in protein and fat, essential for maintaining body heat in sub-zero temperatures. Grains, legumes, and root vegetables formed the backbone of daily meals. Barley, oats, and rye were ground into coarse flours and baked into dense bread or boiled into porridge, a simple yet sustaining dish eaten morning and night. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions, were stored in cool, dry cellars or buried in straw-lined pits to resist freezing, providing crucial vitamins when fresh greens were unavailable. Even during scarcity, nothing was wasted. Leftovers were repurposed into soups or stews, the liquid extracting every bit of flavour and nutrition. Dairy was equally essential. Goats and cows provided milk, which was transformed into cheese or fermented into skaya, a thick, protein-rich food that could be eaten raw or mixed into porridges. These dairy products were not only sustenance, they were high-calorie, easily stored, and a vital source of warmth during long nights. Butter and tallow, byproducts of dairy, fueled cooking fires and preserved other foods, showing the Vikings' mastery of turning every resource into survival tools. Seasonings were minimal but functional. Salt, gathered from coastal evaporation or mined inland, preserved food and encouraged sweating, which paradoxically helped the body retain warmth. Herbs like dill, thyme, and wild garlic, sometimes stored in bundles, enhanced both flavour and medicinal value, helping prevent illness during the harsh months. Meals were communal, eaten around the hearth, where firelight flickered on wooden walls and furs. Sharing food was not just practical, it reinforced bonds, ensured everyone received adequate nutrition, and allowed families to pass on knowledge about preserving, cooking, and rationing. The act of eating became a ritual of survival, a reaffirmation of life against the encroaching cold. Even with these strategies, winter tested limits. Frost-bitten hands, numb toes, and hunger were constant threats. But the Vikings' careful planning, the blending of protein, fat, and carbohydrates, and the ritualized preparation of food turned scarcity into sustainability. Each bite was a deliberate defense against the icy wilderness outside, each meal a small victory over the relentless north. Through fire and feast, the Vikings endured. The cold may have surrounded them, yet the longhouse glowed with warmth and strength, and bellies full of hearty sustenance allowed bodies to fight frost, fatigue, and famine alike. In the northern night, survival was never accidental. It was earned, one carefully prepared meal at a time. In the frozen expanses of the Viking world, survival was rarely an individual endeavour. The biting winds, snow-laden forests, and endless nights demanded cooperation, ingenuity, and a deep sense of shared purpose. Alone, a man or woman might shiver through a single winter, but together, Viking communities thrived. The longhouse was the heart of this communal strength. Massive timber structures, reinforced with wattle, clay, and animal hides, were home not just to a single family, but often to extended kin, neighbours, and even travellers seeking refuge from storms. Inside, firs and rushes lined the floors, and a central hearth burned day and night. Heat radiated outward, shared by all, while the smoke carried warmth and light, creating an environment in which survival became a collective effort. Every household had roles carefully divided. Some tended the fire, some prepared food, and others repaired clothing and tools. Each task, however menial it seemed, was vital to the survival of the group. Vikings understood that knowledge was as critical as skill. Elders shared wisdom on tracking game through snow, identifying edible roots under frozen soil, and predicting storms by the subtle shifts in wind and sky. Children learned by observing and participating in chores that were simultaneously survival exercises. A young boy might help dry fish or repair sleds, while a girl learned to weave, mend, and preserve food. Each lesson was a thread in a tapestry of collective endurance, ensuring that no knowledge of survival was lost, even when harsh winters claimed lives. Work and play often merged in these communal settings. Snow became both a hazard and a training ground. Children and adults built temporary shelters, tested sleds, and even engaged in mock hunts. These exercises were practical. They strengthened bodies, refined coordination, and reinforced techniques essential for procuring food or escaping danger, but they also forged bonds. Trust, familiarity, and mutual dependence were cultivated through shared labor, laughter, and the quiet, constant vigilance against nature's extremes. Trade and bartering extended this sense of community beyond the longhouse. Villages exchanged goods, salted meat, wool, dairy, and crafted tools, ensuring that even those living at the edges of survival had access to essentials they couldn't produce alone. During the darkest months, neighbors combined resources, sharing not just food and fuel, but also labor and intelligence about hidden hazards or opportunities in the surrounding wilderness. Even in celebration, survival instincts prevailed. Feasts, storytelling, and song weren't mere distractions, they reinforced unity, morale, and cultural identity. Around the flickering fires, tales of ancestors, victories, and ingenuity reminded everyone that life was worth enduring, that hardship was part of a larger, collective journey. In the harsh northern night, community was armor. It transformed vulnerability into resilience and isolation into strength. Alone, a frozen landscape could claim a life. Together, a village became a fortress. Vikings did not survive the cold merely by fighting it. They survived by embracing one another, sharing warmth, skills, and hope. In every meal prepared, every fire stoked, and every hand extended, the people of the North demonstrated that the true measure of endurance is not individual toughness, but the bonds that bind a community through the fiercest winters.